So what I want to do today is basically just introduce Alan Magill, talk a bit about his vision, which is basically comes down to two different bits of sort of getting rid of the reservoir and making sure people don't transmit. So if you take nothing else away, those are the two bits. So here's Alan on the right. He's on the course that Diana Worth runs, that Gina was involved in for a while, where we're teaching about malaria eradication, and that is his 80-slide deck. So we've probably got to find some way of publishing it. The Gates Foundation is, at the time, was not that good at publishing sort of internal strategy documents, but I think after 10 years, then we can try it. Okay, so Alan's central thesis. So this is an Alan slide. I haven't messed around with it. Was basically saying we cannot continue business as usual. We have to do something better. And his argument was based on a number of things that I won't go through here. But basically he's saying that two things. One is people will get bored, funders will get bored, that you cannot keep asking for 5 billion a year for the next 100 years. But more importantly, the parasite is clever. And so evolution will hit you that, we say, the culture mutations came out in Southeast Asia in 2005, 2007, and they've come to Africa. The phenotype hasn't changed that much. The parasite is mutating. It's just we haven't figured out what it's mutating into and what its next thing will be. And so Alan's central message, which, Alan trained as a clinician, but he worked in the army. He was US Army, so he's very much mission orientated. What is the goal? Where are we trying to get to? What is the plan? Was to say we have to hit the parasite harder with everything we've got simultaneously if we're going to beat that evolution. So that's the slide everybody shows, but Alan would probably shrug his shoulders and say, well, this sort of thing happens all the time, that just because you're not winning doesn't mean to say that you should lose heart. That means you should fight harder. Okay, so the Red Queen, we talk a lot about the Red Queen, and for people who didn't grow up in sort of the United Kingdom or countries that have Lewis Carroll, you tend to go back and say, well, this is some old English parable. It's actually a quote from evolutionary biology. So there's a paper in 1973 that brings it up that says basically, if you're fighting predator against prey and you want to beat something that's evolving, you have to evolve faster. You have to get better strategies. So the Red Queen was always, it's a story that the girl is saying, Alice is saying, I keep running and I don't get anywhere. And the Red Queen says, that's perfectly normal. You just have to run faster. So we see this in this conference center. You see somebody on the escalator and you're going down and you have to run. And you never quite do it. You have to run twice as fast. And it's a really difficult one to get over to people to say, we're spending 5 billion a year and we're just treading water. Can we have some more money? But Alan's argument, and it was elaborated on by other people, say if we can push to eradication, then the global saving, and I had that on the previous slide, in terms of economic development for Africa would be $2 trillion, so 2 with 12 zeros afterwards. And I think sometimes we don't make that case. We say it's really important because of suffering, it's important because of deaths, it's important because of public health, but say it's important economically. And if you take a number away from this, the number is $1.9 trillion for malaria eradication. When you're talking to a finance minister, that's an important number. So what do we mean by eradication? So Alan took this slide from Emilio Pampagna and say, it's wonderful in English. It says, malaria eradication is to extirpate the roots of infection. Great. So what he means by that, and this is the WHO definition around 2012, was the reduction to zero of worldwide incidence of infection. And that's been the real, you sit in meetings where people say, well, are we trying to stop deaths? Are we trying to stop cases? And Alan is saying, no, we're trying to stop infection. Right? That if you stop the infectious reservoir, you will stop the cases and you'll stop the deaths. Sometimes that got misinterpreted, that people said, so we're not interested in the mortality. And you say, sure, that's the thing that keeps us awake at night. But without getting rid of that reservoir, we won't get anywhere. And then, again, these are his slides untouched, but saying, that we all know about Vivax and the hypnozoites, Ovali and the hypnozoites, but reminding everybody that in a semi-immune patient, actually the falciparum infections hang around for a bit, or new infections persist. So this is a long-lasting pool of infection. And we went through a whole period where everybody was standing up at meetings and showing pictures of icebergs, so I won't show that here. But just to say, you know, Alan's slide, the tip of the iceberg is the one that you guys in the clinic are dealing with all the time, taking care of, and these are the things that are in the World Malaria Report, how many cases, how many deaths. And he's sort of saying, well, unless you can get rid of the asymptomatic cases, then you're not going to stop, you're not going to eradicate malaria. And there's a little bit of, I love the word asymptomatic malaria. I'm not a clinician, but you look at, you know, what is the impact of asymptomatic malaria symptomatically on the patient, and you say anemia, all the rest of it, then they're not normal, right? So there is a goal of getting rid of that infectious reservoir which will benefit everybody. So Alan basically, again, very simple, very clear strategy. He had two things. One was to target the human reservoir, and we'll talk about how we do that. And the other was then, you know, when you have somebody who has malaria, for God's sake, make sure they don't transmit to somebody else. So I'll try and do a couple of minutes on each of those. So I think one of the things that's been surprising in the last 12 years since Alan has been the takeoff of SMC. So this was, Brian came to us originally and said, you know, I've done all this work with my colleagues and we need somebody to make the drug. So that was our involvement in it. But to say, you know, the fact that you have 53 million children protected with a reasonably complicated regimen, not the easiest thing to do, but the mothers want it. So the feedback from the field is that actually this works, we want more of it. And you're sort of saying, well, if that works for children under 5 and it works for 53 million kids, and that's a lot of kids, why can't it be done for other people? And that's a little bit, we've left Richard with that talk, so he'll go into the details of thoughts to do that. But I think that's also been a shift of the last 10 years of saying, you know, we've seen just how much drugs can be used to prevent malaria. We use them to prevent malaria, so, you know, what else can be done in the future? I'm going to learn to point this in the right direction soon. So the continuum of, you know, we've got stuff for little kids, we could use it in bigger kids, we've got to make the case that it's cost economical, which means that we will need better drugs, we will need longer acting drugs, and Christina talked about that yesterday. So Richard will go through the gory details of what's going on in all of these areas, but it's just to say all of these are important. So oral chemoprevention, you know, you have SMC, but it'd be nice to have other alternatives to oral chemoprevention. Vaccines, we have people who know far more about it than me in the room, but saying, you know, you've got some really great vaccines, the next generation of expanding, not just increasing their efficacy, but also increasing the protection, making them easier to use. You know, there's an energy now that this can be done. You know, that it's the argument that getting from 0 to 1 is much harder than getting from 1 to 2 to 5. So the fact there are vaccines, so to go from no vaccines to 2 vaccines, major transformation in the way people think. Monoclonals we talked about yesterday, really exciting, not quite affordable. But, you know, malaria is at the forefront of actually driving that affordability. There is no market pressure whatsoever in things like oncology or rheumatology to push a monoclonal antibody down to $20 a gram. Malaria will drive that for the rest of the world if it happens. This talk following me will be about, you know, the implementation of mass drug administration. So this is just a holding slide, but to say, you know, there have been pilots, we'll hear about that. The messages are that it kind of works well. I mean, it originally worked well in Vivax areas in China. So what we have to work out is how to make it work in falciparum, and there will be lessons to learn on the way. That at the moment, quite a few of the pilots didn't show long-term protection, but the question is, what do we have to do to increase the pressure on the parasite? So then in terms of effective transmission, it's just saying, you know, we're trying to move from treating the patient to stopping transmission. And again, that's been internally that's been quite hard as a discussion, because measuring transmission blocking in a preclinical setting or in a test tube is quite hard. So we're good at doing blood stage assays, liver stage assays, but understanding the complex world of transmission has always been slightly harder. So I stole this slide from Philip because I thought he might be here today. But so this is how Philip's modelling has changed in the last 12 years. So I tease him with that. But to say one of the things that really has changed, and you see this outside the scientific world. 15 years ago, Bob Sinden would stand up and talk about R0 and how we had to drop R0, and we'd all glaze over slightly because you know how the equation works and everything like that, but you don't really understand it. COVID brought us a tremendous gift. Even my brother understands R0, right? And he understands, you know, they used to have the R0 is dropping, in Switzerland they have R0 is dropping below 0.9. We should all get excited. So I think looking at this slide, two messages for you. Understand R0. If you can get R0 down to 0.9, that would be great. But you see, if it's at 0.9, okay, we can debate the modeling, but if it's at 0.9, we're going to have to be patient. If we're impatient, we really need to drive it down much, much lower than that. And for that, we'll need better tools. So we have low-dose primaquine. There's an interesting discussion over coffee. You know, 2012, WHO recommended low-dose primaquine in areas of low transmission. The data shows that it works really nicely. So it's much more, you know, trying to work out how to use it, where to use it, and more to the point, actually having the tablet. So malaria is one of these few disease areas where you have a WHO recommendation and nobody's actually making the drug. So one of the big steps forward, Fosun has actually now made the 2.5s and they're pre-qualified. So you could actually use low-dose primaquine in children and look at that. So that will be interesting to go forward. But you know, we can talk about, you know, putting the low-dose primaquine in the ACT packages, co-blistering, making it easier for the field. But ultimately, it'd be really nice to have something that's primaquine sparing, right? That you don't need to worry about the primaquine, or actually is better than primaquine. Right? It's good enough, but it's good enough. So this is the only MMV slide I've got. But it says, along the bottom is the progress of time, right? It's a 20-year horizon. Each of those is a development candidate. There are about 20 of them. So these are things going into formal regulatory talks. The ones in purple are the ones that have survived, and that you normally over a 10-year period, you'd expect sort of 3/4 of them to die. So survival rate of projects is actually quite good. There are 7 molecules in phase 2 that weren't there even 10 years ago. So that's moving forward. Primary job of new drugs is to overcome resistance. Let's not blur that one. So all these drugs are targeting clinical resistance and so on. The size of the circle shows how good they are about blocking resistance. How far down they are, which is the downward trend that we like to show, is how the dose is changing. And given that children vomit, then low dose is good, but also lower dose is cheaper, and this is a market where cost is everything. So, you know, coming up with cheaper, more efficient drugs is good. On the right-hand side, and I haven't had time to do it, you can see the portfolio the other way around. You can see these little grey mosquitoes. Those are the ones with transmission blocking activity. And so the question is, when a new drug combination is launched, one of them needs to have transmission blocking, and the transmission blocking needs to be as good, if not better, than low-dose primaquine. So you need to come to Cornelis's session at 4 o'clock, is it? So 5 o'clock. 6:45. You need to wait to 6:45 and ask him about his transmission blocking. We can do more than that. Quick flag, you know, that you saw from Carlos's data, Gina's data on ivermectin in the Bohemia trials, that, you know, it's heroic what they did there. And one of the issues with ivermectin is that it's only around for a couple of days. So if we had an endecticide that had a half-life of 90 days, programmatically that would be beautiful. You wouldn't have to have the same rigid focus of delivering things. So we're working on lotilena. It does really well for your dog. That's Bravecto, the thing that you... and again, it's interesting, you know, you have drugs that we have a high priority for our canine friends sometimes. So, for Alan, we're moving from medicines and vaccines to protect children, seasonal chemoprevention, the vaccines, to saying we need protection for everybody. We need to get rid of that reservoir. So it's not just getting rid of the asymptomatic infections, it's in as many people as possible, and that will include going into women of childbearing age and even pregnant women. And then on the flip side, the second point that he made, the gametosite, we kind of, we've moved forward a little bit with the low-dose primaquine and gametosite carriage, but it really hasn't bitten. And so the question for the new generation of drugs is, can we do better than primaquine without having to add it? And I'll stop there. I mean, I think if you look back on it, then Alan would be intrigued about the way that things have differed from the way we planned at the time. But to say what's interesting is now you have a whole series of new tools coming through which fit those two criteria. And the question will be, I think what we've learned is making sure that the community is ready to accept them when they come to market, so that they can be deployed straight away. But that's for the next speakers. So thank you, and I guess we take questions at the end. But thank you.